Europe's strategy was simple. It wanted to cut its dependence on Russian energy sources. So Europe decided to ban Russian oil imports beginning next month. And it also decided to greatly reduce consumption of Russian natural gas. On its part, Russia has greatly cut down supplies of natural gas to Europe via existing pipelines. But Europe continues to buy Russian LNG, which is more expensive than piped natural gas. Basically, Europe is more interested in creating the illusion of it abandoning Russian fuels. And to create the illusion, Europe is paying a heavy price. Russia has greatly reduced flows of natural gas into Europe. To complicate matters further, the Nord Stream pipelines were sabotaged and rendered useless in September. Now, Europe is having to invest in something called floating LNG terminals. These floating liquid natural gas terminals help countries acquire the ability to almost instantly begin importing LNG. These terminals allow for LNG cargoes to be unloaded and converted into gaseous state once again. Once converted into the gaseous form, these terminals will allow for the natural gas to be fed to the country's energy grid. Here's why these floating LNG terminals make life so easy for countries. As opposed to permanent facilities, these floating terminals require very little time to begin operations. While permanent LNG terminals can take years to build, floating LNG terminals can be bought, set up, and made operational within a few months, if not weeks. For countries in Europe who are going through a major energy disruption, these floating terminals have come as a blessing. But they're very expensive, and Germany has realized this the hard way. It's not all very rosy for Europe. Floating LNG terminals come with their own set of headaches, mostly financial. The cost of the planned liquefied natural gas terminals will cost Germany, for example, 3.5 billion euros more than planned. Previously, Germany had set aside 2.94 billion euros for the LNG terminals. Now that figure has gone up to 6.56 billion euros. So, Germany is going to pay twice as much to set up these terminals than it had initially thought. 2 government-run terminals are set to become operational in late December or early January. Meanwhile, a private enterprise is set to inaugurate its floating LNG terminal around the same time. The 3 floating LNG terminals would enable Germany to import 15 billion cubic meters of gas annually. Next year, Germany will get another 3 floating LNG terminals, further increasing its capacity to import LNG. Interestingly, Europe continues to depend on Russian LNG supplies. Imports of LNG rose around 20% between March and October compared to the same period in 2021. Now guess how much LNG Russia supplies to Europe every year. Moscow provides around 15% of Europe's LNG. Given how tight the global natural gas market is, finding replacements for such a large share of Russian LNG won't be possible anytime soon. That's why Europe has continued buying Russian LNG and has not imposed sanctions on it. So here's the gist of what has just happened. For years, Europe was getting cheap Russian gas through several pipelines. Europe's industries relied on cheap Russian gas for their operations. Suddenly, the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Moscow changed all of that. Russia decided to snap pipeline gas flows to Europe, but it continued selling LNG to Europe, and European nations continued buying the fuel quietly. In the process, countries like Germany have had to commit billions towards developing infrastructure required to import large amounts of LNG. Essentially, Europe has just developed a more expensive way to get supplies of natural gas, including from Russia. And it helps anyone but the Europeans. So do you think Europe could have avoided these